Okay, Chapter 8, Flexible Budgets with Overhead Cost Variances, and this is Part 2. Now, before we got to here, and all we really did, we talked about planning, that is an interesting topic, and then computing the variable overhead flexible budget variance with efficiency and spending. Okay, so this was the total, and then efficiency and spending are the two components of it. And now what the major point of this section is the fixed overhead flexible budget variance. And then there's some more, okay, the four variance approach, relationships between sales volume variance and production volume variance. And then we'll look a little bit at the activity-based costing. But I think we'll have to do some things in a separate presentation too, and that would be the journal entries. And then I'm looking at some of this stuff using T accounts, okay, so you can see how it's moving through work in process. Now, this was the variable analysis that we looked at. This is where we left off. And this is if you read it from the bottom up, that's the level 2 variance, and there's level 3. And level 3 takes it apart between spending and efficiency variance. And when you really look at it, it's not so bad, okay? This is all actual. And then this is actual quantity times budgeted rate, the old flexible. And now what they're calling flexible is this budgeted input quantity allowed for actual output, okay? So our budgeted input quantity is 0.4 hours per unit times 10,000 actual units, all right, at $30 an hour. That was our budgeted rate. Okay, so that would give you the difference between actual and this. The flexible budget is your flexible budget variance. And then we can take it apart a little bit more and look at what was due to spending and what was due to efficiency. And this is great information. You can really see that the efficiency variance is significant. It was $15,000. It's pretty big. You might want to find out more about it. And the spending, because it's unfavorable, the spending variance, though, is favorable. All right, so they spent a little bit less. It looks like we had it in there at $30 an hour. Instead, it came in at $29. So the fixed overhead flexible budget variance is simply the difference between actual fixed overhead costs and fixed overhead costs in the flexible budget. Okay, that's what it is. And make sure that you do the short problems with me that go along here, because it just helps get the formulas and the format and everything in your head. And the fixed overhead spending variance is the same variance as the fixed overhead flexible budget variance. Okay, you'll see in the example that we do. So the formula is actual costs incurred minus flexible budget amount. That's the fixed overhead budget variance. Now, the production volume variance is the difference between budgeted fixed overhead and fixed overhead allocated on the basis of actual output produced. So that would have been what was allocated to jobs or something like this. The variance is also known as the denominator level variance, as the output level overhead variance, because that is the basis of the variance. Okay, and here's the formula for it. The budgeted fixed overhead minus what's allocated for actual units produced. That gives us our production volume variance. Now, in the example, the variance is unfavorable because due to lower than planned volume, we were unable to allocate the budgeted amount of fixed cost. Now, I put this in here, and this is the example that they go through within the book, but you want to pay attention, come back to this sentence. All right, so the variance is because whether or not it's favorable or unfavorable is really hard to see. And you're looking at the difference maybe between, in this case, it's budgeted fixed overhead and then allocated fixed overhead. But even the difference between the actual and the allocated is hard to see why it's favorable or unfavorable. Okay, so you want to make up some story in your head that makes sense to you when you see it. Otherwise, it's going to throw you. So lump sum fixed costs represent the cost of acquiring capacity, right? And an analysis of the production volume variance should include questions like, why did the overcapacity occur? Why were only 10,000 units produced? Is there a quality problem? Okay, so interpretation of this variance is difficult because of the nature of the costs and how they're budgeted. Fixed costs, by definition, are somewhat inflexible. While market conditions may cause production to flex up or down, those associated fixed costs just stay flat, they stay the same. So fixed costs are also set years in advance. I mean, maybe 5 years in advance, and they might be difficult to change quickly. For sure they will be. But in spite of this, examination of the fixed overhead budget formula reveals that it's similar to a variable cost. I mean, if you've got enough time, everything's variable. So here is the basic formula for it. This is fixed overhead variance analysis. And these are actual costs incurred. Okay, so actual costs to flexible budget, and this is the same as the static budget. Okay, the flexible budget and the static budget are the same. And then what's been allocated? And what's allocated is the budgeted input quantity allowed for actual output. Okay, so it might be a quarter pound times $10 or whatever. Oh no, a quarter pound for each unit, for each actual unit produced. Okay, times the budgeted rate. Okay, the budgeted rate, and that makes sense. So here's actual, and then just a static budget, and then we've got what we allocated. Okay, so here we've got, well, let's look at our actual first is given. Okay, we've got 285,000. The flexible was 276,000, so I've got a $9,000 unfavorable spending variance, and that makes sense because our actual costs are higher than what we budgeted. Okay, so that unfavorable is a good thing. Now let's go over here. This is the difference between the flexible budget, okay, which is the same as a static budget. Regardless of output level, we budgeted 276,000. But if we look now at the budgeted input for the actual output, okay, times the budgeted rate, I've got 0.4 hours times 10,000 units, and our budgeted rate is 57.50. So our what was allocated was 230,000. Okay, so we allocated 230,000 and the budget was 276,000. So then you've got $46,000 unfavorable. And one way you can think of it is that we're going to have to make up for what hasn't been allocated, I don't know, but it's unfavorable. You would think that because it was under budget that it would be favorable. That is not the way to think about it. So we've got to come up with a good sentence for this. It is not intuitive. And here's both the spending variance and the flexible budget variance are the same. So that is level 2 would still be the $9,000. The only reason they're the same is because two of these columns, the budgeted lump sum and the flexible budget, is equal to the lump sum amount. Okay, they're the same thing. So we just have one column here for them. And this is the whole deal. And when you first look at it, it's awful. But it's not really that bad because this is the flexible manufacturing overhead that we did first. Okay, that was the first piece we did. And you got through that. Over here, there's never a variance, so don't even worry about this. Well, till the very end. These 3 columns. And then we just did the fixed manufacturing overhead, and that's down here. Okay, so if you put the 2 together, it looks like a big chart, but it's really not that bad. So this is another view of the 4 variance analysis, and this indicates what kind of variances are expected for variable and fixed overhead. Variable overhead will never have a production volume variance, okay? And fixed overhead will never have an efficiency variance, okay? So under fixed, we'll have the spending variance and a production volume, okay? And under variable overhead, we've got a spending variance and an efficiency variance. So you might remember from Chapter 7 that the static budget variance, the difference between the static budget and the actual results, was 93,100 unfavorable for the sample company. Okay, that's in the book. The sales volume variance, that's the difference between the flexible budget and the static budget, was 64,000 unfavorable. And the sales volume variance consists of two components: operating income volume variance and production volume variance. Doesn't get any better than this. So here are all of our variances. So there's our static budget variance that we just talked about, 93.1. And the flexible budget was 29.1. Sales volume variance was 64,000. Okay, the flexible budget is taken apart into, well, we've got a selling price variance, but also direct materials, labor, variable overhead, and fixed overhead. Okay, and then we take it down one more step. This is the level 3 variance here. So this is a combination of chapters 7 and 8 together. And here's an example of a variance analysis for an activity when a company uses activity-based costing. And this example is actually in your book on page 309, and page 311, I'm not sure about the page numbers, but it might be around Exhibit 8.6, that's what it is. But activity-based costing systems, they focus on individual activities as the cost object. That's the point of ABC costing. And variances are calculated for each activity. So here's an example of the variance analysis for one activity at Lyco Brassworks. Okay, and the thing of it is, it's you know, whether you want to call it an activity, a process, or a product, it doesn't matter. It's still the same formulas. So it's just cut a different way. Now, non-manufacturing companies can benefit from overhead variances just like manufacturing companies can. The variance analysis can be used to examine overhead costs and make decisions about pricing, managing costs, and the mix of products. These are all important things and are really difficult in a service company. But measures for these companies will be different. Oh yeah, we talked, it could be passenger miles flown, patient days provided, room days occupied, ton miles of freight hauled. Okay, and it's funny with the passenger miles flown, you don't think of an airline as a service industry, but it really is. Okay. So the overhead variances we talked about are examples of financial performance measures, but non-financial measures, such as those related to capacity utilization and physical measures of input usage, also provide good information. So in order to evaluate managerial performance, you really need to look at financial and non-financial performance measures. So be sure to carefully do these problems and notice the difference between the columns, okay, for what these variances are. And on top of that, you've got to know what the variance names are. So when you look at it, you know the difference between a spending and efficiency, or what the flexible budget variance really represents. I actually think that's the hardest part. Okay.